Hey guys, do you know about a time before thunder ruled the skies, before kings, before mortals, before even the gods as we know them tonight? We trace the origin of Olympus, not by scaling a mountain, but by drifting back into a universe that had yet to find form. There was no sunlight, no time, and certainly no lightning bolts. Only a swirling, formless mass. Chaos from chaos. The first ancient forces emerged, not people, not even personalities, but raw, primordial ideas. Gaia, the earth, emerged with a firm surface and the ability to give birth. Then came Tartarus, the deep abyss beneath existence, and Eros, a spark of attraction that would make things collide, combine, and create. Out of Gaia herself came Uranus, the sky, who blanketed her with stars and mist and shadows. From their union came the Titanomachy, with elemental names, who walked the earth with limbs as vast as rivers and spines like mountain ranges. But here's the thing about immortal families, they're rarely peaceful. Uranus didn't exactly hand out best dad awards. He feared his children's power, so he imprisoned the strongest of them, like the 100-handed giants and the cyclops deep in Gaia's belly. Not metaphorically, literally. That's ancient parenting for you. Gaia, not thrilled about being an eternal prison cell, devised a plan. Among her children, one stood out, Cronus, a titan with a sharp mind and an even sharper sickle. She offered him a blade of unbreakable adamant and whispered a secret: time could be cut, and so could fate. One night, as Uranus descended to lie with Gaia, Cronus rose with the blade and attacked. He severed his father, and from the falling blood came other being, some lovely, some monstrous, all-powerful. Aphrodite, the goddess of love, is said by some to have been born from the foam that formed where Uranus's body met the sea. Scholars still debate whether this version of her origin predates the more popular tale, but either way, it's oddly poetic and a little awkward. Cronus seized control. He freed his Titan siblings and ruled from a towering peak. For a while, peace reigned, but as always, old curses cling. Before Uranus fell, he hissed one final prophecy: you too will be overthrown by your own child. Now, if you're a Titan with daddy issues and a prophecy looming over your throne, what do you Usurper journeying? Nope. Cronus went full nightmare mode. He married his sister Rebecca's. Mythologies often forget Boundaris, and every time she gave birth, he swallowed the baby whole. Not symbolically. He literally opened his jaw and gulped them down like grapes. Hestia, Hera, Hades, Demeter, Poseidon, all of them devoured by their father before they could cry out their own names. It was cruel, calculated, and deeply disturbing. Cronus believed that if no child walked free, none could fulfill the prophecy. But time, ironically, was not on Cronus's side. When Rhea became pregnant with her 6th child, she reached her breaking point, tired of watching her children disappear. Into the belly of tyranny, she sought help. She turned to Gaia, who had once helped Cronus defeat Uranus. Now, the cycle would spin again. The plan was simple in theory, risky in execution. When Rhea gave birth, she didn't call Cronus. She didn't lay the child at his feet. Instead, she spirited the newborn away, under the cover of night, and wrapped a stone in swaddling cloth. A fake baby, a decoy. Cronus, paranoid and ever hungry for safety, swallowed it without question, and the real child, the boy who would one day throw thunder across the sky. He was taken to a hidden cave on the island of Crete. Nestled beneath sharp cliffs and olive trees, the cave was sacred and deep. Here, the baby Zeus was raised in secret, nursed by the divine goat Amalthea. His cradle hung from a tree so it touched neither earth, sea, nor sky, just in case fate got sneaky. Meanwhile, a band of armored youths, known as the Curetes, clashed their weapons and danced ferociously outside the cave, drowning out the infant's cries with clatter and chaos. Imagine growing up to the sound of sword choreography, just so your dad doesn't hear you. Historians and mythographers still debate whether this tale was symbolic of a seasonal cycle, or perhaps a metaphor for political overthrows common in the ancient world. Either way, it's epic babysitting. And so Zeus grew, unknown to his father, a forgotten spark waiting to ignite the future. He played among olive trees, bathed in holy springs, and stared up at a sky that would one day be his to command. He learned to wrestle, to run, to speak with birds, and to listen to the rumble of the world's bones. No thunder yet, but it was coming, because a hidden child does not stay hidden forever. And prophecies, no matter how many babies you eat, have a nasty habit of finding their way home. Cronus ruled the cosmos with a grim sense of order. The other titans followed him not out of affection, but because the alternative was chaos, and they remembered all too well what that looked like. Under his reign, the stars wheeled steadily. The seas stayed within their bounds, and time flowed forward like a river. But beneath that orderly surface simmered something ancient and inevitable, the cost of fear. Fear had made Cronus powerful. It had driven him to overthrow his father, to swallow his children, to stare at every shadow as though it might rise up and challenge him. And so, despite his strength and his crown of stone, the Titan King was always looking over his shoulder. Meanwhile, on Crete, the child Cronus feared most was growing taller, louder, and more curious. Zeus, raised among sacred groves and goats' milk, had inherited not only his father's power, but also his mother's cleverness. He wasn't just strong, was watchful. He questioned things, the rustling of olive trees, the way thunder sometimes echoed in a clear sky, the stories told by nymphs who visited his cave. He listened closely when Amalthea, the divine goat who nursed him, hummed old lullabies that weren't meant for children. He noticed the way the Curetes danced with urgency, not joy. He saw how the sky seemed to bend above him, as though waiting for something, and one day, Metis appeared. Metis was not a Titan, nor an Olympian. She was older than names, a primordial goddess of wisdom and deep thought, born from Oceanus and Tethys. Her presence was like still water, calm, but with depth that could drown you if you stared too long. She arrived without warning, stepping into Zeus's hidden world, like a breeze that knew too many secrets. She didn't bow to him, or coo over his divine glow. She simply said, "It's time." Zeus didn't know what she meant, but she did. She knew the prophecy Uranus had muttered. She knew Cronus's fear, and she knew the old ways of undoing power, so she told Zeus a plan, one that involved returning to the world his father thought he'd erased him from, one that required trickery, courage, and a very unusual drink. Here's where things get messy. Cronus had by this point eaten 5 of his children and 1 tightly wrapped rock. He believed his throne was safe. His gut may have been heavy with regret, but he was certain the future had been swallowed. Enter Zeus net with thunder, but with quiet precision. He didn't storm the palace or throw bolts of light. He came as a stranger, disguised, carrying a cup. This cup held a potion brewed by Metis, a golden mixture, bubbling with herbs, 2 ancient forenames, and the magic of forgotten rivers. Its purpose to make Cronus violently, thoroughly sick, and not just the headache and lie down kind of sick. Cronus accepted the cup without suspicion. Perhaps he thought it was wine, or nectar, or simply enjoyed being adored by lesser beings. Whatever the case, he drank. Moments later, the Titan King clutched his stomach and groaned. The palace rumbled. His eyes rolled. Then, in a scene no one in Olympus would ever forget, the vomited. Out came Poseidon, dripping and dazed, then Hades, blinking in confusion, then Hera, furious at everything, then Demeter and Hestia, clutching each other and gasping for air. The children he had swallowed, trapped in stasis for what might have felt like moments or centuries, tumbled into the world again, reborn by force. It was grotesque. It was magnificent. It was exactly what destiny had required. Scholars and storytellers still debate whether this release was literal or allegorical. Was Cronus's swallowing a symbol of stifled potential? Was the regurgitation a mythic metaphor for rebirth? Possibly. But even if you lean toward the symbolic, it's hard to ignore the very specific, almost comically physical details the ancient texts provide. The Greeks, subtle as they could be, were never shy about divine bodily functions. With the 6 siblings reunited, something ancient and electric rippled through the cosmos. Zeus, now revealed in full glory, stood among them not as the youngest, but as the one who had set them free. And they remembered. They remembered the darkness inside their father. They remembered the silence of his belly, the way time seemed to stretch and break in there. They remembered fear, but now they had fury. Zeus called them not to vengeance, but to justice. A new order, he claimed, could be forget-not, just a reaction to pain, but a foundation for something greater. He spoke with clarity beyond his years, a kind of divine charisma that pulled the others into his orbit, like moons around a planet. And yet, not all were convinced. Hades, who had known silence more intimately than the others, was cautious. Hera, sharp-tanked and ever calculating, demanded proof that Zeus wasn't just another Cronus in the making. Demeter longed for peace, not war, but Poseidon's sea-brother, the unpredictable one, threw his lot in immediately, clapping Zeus on the back with a grin that cracked marble. The decision didn't take long. The 6 agreed. They would challenge the Titans, not just to dethrone Cronus, but to end an era ruled by fear. What followed was not a sudden storm, but a steady rising wind. The Olympians began gathering power, allies, and symbols. Zeus received a gift from the Cyclopes, 3 ancient smiths, with 1 eye each, and a penchant for building weapons that defied logic. To him, they gave thunder and the lightning bolt, not just a weapon, but a declaration. The skies answered when he called. The earth trembled when he walked. Poseidon received the trident, a forked blade that stirred oceans with a whisper. Hades was granted the helm of darkness, which allowed him to vanish from sight and travel through shadows. An unsettling gift, but effective. Each sibling bore a mark of divine purpose. Each had tasted death without dying. And now, they were ready to bring fire to the old world, from Mount Olympus. Not yet crowned, but already sacred, they looked out across the earth and beyond, toward Mount Olympus, where the Titans had gathered. A war was coming, but for now, there was silence. The kind of silence right before lightning breaks the sky. The Titans knew. Cronus may have believed his rule unshakable. But when his children stood before him, Ground, Divine, and Armide, recognized the prophecy coiling into reality. His expression, once proud and unreadable, cracked at the edges. The other Titans, too, sensed it. For centuries, they had moved like mountains, slow, certain, dominant. But now the earth beneath them whispered a different rhythm. The war had not yet begun, but the lines were drawn. On one side, the Olympian young, fast, and burning with the urgency of a new world. On the other, the Titansmen's ancient, and bound by the old rules. It was not just a battle for power, but for the future itself. The Olympians were few. Zeus, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, Demeter, and Hestia, 6 against 12. The odds did not favor them, but what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in clarity. They did not want to inherit Cronus's thronothy, wanted to change what thrones even meant. The Titans, meanwhile, were led by Cronus, who now carried the weight of time as both weapon and burden. Beside him stood Iapetus, the strategist, Hyperion, the Titan of light, and Cous, the inquirer, whose mind could bend logic. But others hesitated. Oceanus, ever distant, preferred the depths of his river realm. Themis, bound to justice, frowned at the balance of things. Some say she saw where the tide was turning. Scholars still debate whether her neutrality was an early sign of the Olympians. Moral legitimacy, or simply political pragmatism. War, when it came, did not begin with a single strike. It began with weather. Clouds darkened above Mount Olympus. Winds pulled unnaturally from every direction. Rain lashed stone and leaves alike, though no season had called for it. Birds flew in patterns no flock had ever known. Animals cowered. Mortals chose few, who walked the early earth told. Stories of skies that bled silver, and mountains that trembled like reeds. And then, thunder. Zeus hurled his first bolt, a crack of light that split the heavens, and announced that the age of Titans would be challenged by flame and will. Poseidon rose from the sea with waves the size of valleys, his trident calling forth whirlpools and salt-soaked tremors that battered the shores of Titan's strongholds. Hades, unseen, crept beneath the earth, whispering to the stones themselves. Unbinding roots and ancient bones, collapsing caverns beneath the feet of Titans, who thought themselves unshakable. The first battle took place near the base of Mount Olympus. Trees were flattened into splinters. Rivers reversed. Time Cronus's greatest ally seemed to stutter. The Olympians fought with desperation, unsure if their divine blood would truly protect them. The Titans fought with rage, insulted by the defiance of their own blood. 100 stories unfolded in a single clash. Hera, though young, outmaneuvered Thea in a battle of misdirection, tricking her elder into chasing illusions. Demeter caused vines to surge from the ground and bind Titan ankles, only for Hyperion to burn them away with a glance. Hades whispered through shadow, dragging Titans momentarily into darkness to disorient them. And Zeus was everywhere. His lightning did not just strike, it commanded. It bent air and space. It seared names into the sky. But power was not enough. The Titans were losing slowly. Yes, but not enough to end it. The war dragged on, relentless. Skies blackened, crops died, earthquakes spread across the continents. The sun and moon staggered in their courses. For mortals, it was a time of mythic terror. For gods, a test of identity. 10 years passed. 10 years of battle. 10 years of shifting tactics, betrayals, wariness. 10 years of siblings fighting beside siblings, gods dying and reforming, Titans crumbling and returning. The Olympians began to weaken. They needed help, and so Zeus descended not to the battlefield, but to the abyss. Far below the roots of the world lay Tartarus, not merely a prison, but a concept, the place where uncontainable things were contained. There, in chains older than thought, lay the Hecatoncheresh 100-handed ones. They were monsters by appearance, yes, but not by heart. Cursed by Uranus, imprisoned by Cronus, forgotten by most. Each had 100 arms and 50 heads. Their rage simmered not with evil, but injustice. Zeus walked into Tartarus alone. His feet echoed like bells in a crypt. The air was heavy with loss. He stood before Briareus Catus, and Gigestio names thudding like war drums, and made a vow. Freedom for loyalty, not servitude, not control, just a shared purpose. And they listened, one by one, their chains snapped. The walls of Tartarus, startled by the choice, did not resist. When the 100-handed ones rose, the sky blinked. Returning to Olympus with them was like bringing walking cataclysms to a bonfire. The balance shifted. Their arrival marked the second wave. Now, on the battlefield, Zeus fought alongside beings who could throw boulders the size of cities, who could flatten mountain passes with a sweep of 20 arms. Poseidon guided them like ocean currents, and Hades cloaked their advance in shadow. The Titans, once towering above all, now found themselves outmatched not by number, but by fury and precision. It is said that Cronus, upon seeing them, hesitated, and hesitation, in war, is a wound. Zeus pressed forward, bolt after bolt, not random, Surgical names were called and struck down. Titans, who mocked him now fell at his feet, scorched and broken. Cronus still fought but differently now, not as a king, but as a cornered beast. He wielded time like a whip, freezing moments, mid-swing, slowing arrows in the air. But even time bends, eventually, to something stronger, and something stronger was rising. Zeus did not fight alone anymore. He was no longer just the hidden child or the rebellious son. He was becoming the storm, and storms, once started, do not ask permission to end. The final blow had not yet landed, but everyone could feel it coming. The winds changed. The clouds no longer roamed but circled, gathering around Mount Olympus. Even the Titans, bloodied and panting, began to understand. Their time had not just been challenged, had expired, and Cronus, though not yet fallen, saw in Zeus's eyes the truth of every prophecy he had tried to swallow. The sky hung thick over Mount Olympus, as if the clouds themselves were too frightened to move. The battlefield below stretched in all directions, sheared trees, cratered hills, rivers boiled into steam. The very bones of the earth had been rearranged. Titan blood, golden and shimmering, had soaked into the soil. The Olympians stood on the precipice of final victory, but Cronus still stood tall. This was no longer war, this was reckoning. Cronus had not simply been a ruler, he was time incarnate. Every second that passed bent through his will, and in these final moments, he wielded it not with regal detachment, but with wild desperation. He no longer paced with the calm of inevitability lashed out, warping reality around him. Trees aged to dust in seconds. Mountains eroded before they could echo thunder. Warriors froze in place mid-scream, then collapsed with a shudder as time resumed its march. And still, Zeus advanced, not because he was immune to time's bite, but because he no longer feared it. The sky god had shed his cloak of youth. The once hidden child had become a storm made flesh. His lightning bolts no longer stung thee, rewrote the laws of power. His voice cracked the silence like a hammer, not because it was loud, but because it carried conviction, and he wasn't alone. Behind him marched Poseidon, wielding the trident like a spear forged in the hearts of crashing waves. Each strike sent tremors across the battlefield. Hades emerged and vanished like a shadow in motion, drawing lines of silence through Titan ranks. Hera, fierce and focused, coordinated attacks with a tactician's eye, her presence lending structure to chaos. Demeter bloomed and withered the land at will, controlling terrain as if sculpting battle from farmland. Even Hestia, goddess of the hearth, stood unyielding, flame in her hands and steadiness in her gaze. But still Cronus would not fall. He summoned the Titans to him. The remaining loyal ones, Atlas, Cous, Cronus, and a few others circled the mountain, ready to give one last stand. The earth trembled as they chanted in a language lost to mortals, drawing on ancient energies buried beneath creation itself. Cronus called upon time's deepest roots. For a brief moment, the battlefield bent backward, mountains reshaped, lightning bolts reversed mid-flight. For a flickering instant, Zeus was a child again, watching his mother cry, watching Cronus raise his hand, and then Medus's voice cut through the storm. Though absent from the fight itself, Medus's wisdom lingered in Zeus's memory like a compass. "He cannot change what has already become," she had once whispered. "He can twist time, but he cannot rewrite what is already true." Zeus clenched his fist. The illusion broke. Time snapped forward, and Cronus' eyes wide, his breath suddenly. Shala felt the end approach. His hand raised once more, but no longer in strength. This time, it was trembling. Zeus summoned the might of the skies. A final bolt, not white, not gold, but deep blue, formed in his hand. It was not mere electricity. It was authority. It carried every scream from every swallowed child, every second stolen by tyranny, every truth buried in fear. He threw it. The bolt struck Cronus squarely in the chest, not with fire, but with silence. the kind of silence that comes after the truth has been spoken. Cronus staggered. He fell to one knee. Around him, the titans wavered. Then he collapsed, and with him fell the last resistance of the old world. But death was not the fate Zeus chose for his father. No, there were punishments more fitting than death. At Zeus's command, the fallen titans, those who had resisted the new order, were bound in chains of unbreakable divine ore and cast into Tartarus. Not merely cast into darkness, but sealed behind bronze gates, guarded by the 100-handed ones they had once betrayed. Their sentence was not annihilation, but obscurity. Cronus was given no throne, no memory, no power. He vanished into myth, locked in a place where time no longer served him, a fitting reversal for the god who had tried to devour it. But not all titans were condemned. Some, like Oceanus, Themis, and Mnemosyne, had chosen neutrality or subtle resistance. They were allowed to remain. In fact, they would come to play roles in the new world. Themis became a counselor of justice. Mnemosyne, mother of the muses, ensured that memory would not fade, especially the memory of what had been. The sky cleared. The war was over. And now came the question that has haunted all victors. What next? Zeus and his siblings gathered atop Mount Olympus, a place that had stood apart from the war, high enough to avoid the scorch of battle, sacred enough to host something new. The summit was silent, ringed with clouds that curled like curtains waiting to be drawn. There, they stood in a circle. 3 brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. 3 sisters, Hera, Demeter, and Hestia. The 6 who had survived Cronus's reign. The 6 who had ended it, and now, the 6 who would divide what remained. No one had crowned a king. No one had claimed the throne. But the world could not move forward without order. And so, they drew lots, not by war, not by force, by fate. Zeus pulled the sky. Poseidon claimed the sea. Hades took the underworld. Some have suggested the draw was rigged, that Zeus, clever and charismatic, tilted the odds in his favor. Scholars still argue whether the lot was fair or symbolic, but either way, the outcome became law. The heavens, ruled by Zeus; the oceans, commanded by Poseidon; the depths, governed by Hades. As for the sisters, they were given their own domains, yet less visible. Hera became queen of Olympus, and goddess of marriage, politics, and the protection of order. Demeter took the fields, the harvests, and the fertility of earth. Hestia, oldest and gentlest, became the hearth guardian of home, flame, and peace. It was not a perfect system, but it was a beginning, and for the first time in an age, peace whispered across the world. Mortals, who had cowered through storms and shadow, began to rise again. Temples were built, offerings made, stories told. But even as Olympus began to take shape, the winds still carried a hint of what had been a ghost of Cronus, a reminder that no ruler lasts unchallenged, and that every throne is only borrowed. Still, the world turned, and Zeus, now king of gods, stood on his mountaintop and watched it spin. Zeus stood at the edge of Olympus, where the wind is thinnest, and the stars feel closer than clouds. Below him stretched the realms, now Dividencia, foaming with Poseidon's moods, underworld cloaked in Hades' silence, and the earth in between, where mortals were beginning to whisper his name with offerings of grain and honey. The war was over, the old king defeated, the heavens assigned, and yet, it didn't feel complete. Victory never settles easily on the shoulders of a god. Zeus had power no more than he'd ever imagined, while being cradled by a goat or fed by dancing warriors. But with power came shape, expectations, responsibility, and, perhaps most dangerously of all, boredom. He began constructing Olympus, not merely as a seat of rule, but as a new center of cosmic balance. With cyclopes and divine architects at his command, he raised palaces from storm clouds, anchored marble halls to lightning itself, and carved thrones for his siblings from the bones of fallen stars. It became not just a home for gods, but a beacon in the sky, a divine mountain visible from nearly every point of the world, crowned in eternal light. But peace doesn't inspire worship. Mortals, recently recovered from 10 years of mythic war and celestial tantrums, began to forget the cost of that peace. They questioned Zeus's judgment, built shrines to other powers, whispered heresies in barley fields. Worse still, monsters stirred remnants of an older chaos, emboldened by the sudden vacuum left by Cronus's fall. The most terrifying of them was Typhon. No one knows exactly where he came from. Some say Gaia herself, angered by the imprisonment of her Titan children, birthed him in revenge. Others whisper he rose from Tartarus uninvited, a being too monstrous to have a creator. What's agreed upon is this: Typhon was not a beast. He was the idea of wild, uncontrollable destruction made flesh. Wings that blackened the sun, snakes' 4 legs, hands that reached mountains and tore peaks like petals, a voice that mimicked everything it heard in a shrieking, distorted tone. Even Zeus hesitated. The battle between them is the kind of tale mortals would later struggle to retell, so vast in scale that it bends imagination. Typhon launched mountains like arrows. Zeus countered with lightning that cracked open oceans. The sky turned red, then black, then something colorless. Mortals fled. Nymphs wept. Even gods scattered. In one version of the myth, Typhon nearly won. He managed to slice the sinews from Zeus's limbs, hide them in a cave, and leave him helpless. Some say it was Hermes and Pan who retrieved them, tricking Typhon with music and illusion. Others claim Zeus never truly lost control, merely luring Typhon to a final, fatal confrontation near Mount Etna, where the beast was buried beneath the volcano. Either way, the message was clear. Even after victory, Zeus was not safe, and he hated that. His rule had only just begun, and already he saw the cracks. Titans punished, but not forgotten. Monsters silenced, but not erased. And worst of all, humanity, fragile creatures below, constantly pushing the boundaries between reverence and rebellion. Which brings us to Prometheus, a Titan who had sided with the Olympians during the war. Prometheus was clever, loyal, and deeply invested in the fate of mortals, perhaps too invested. After the war, while Zeus turned his gaze to palaces and storms, Prometheus visited the earth. He walked among humans, taught them things they weren't supposed to: no writing, measurement, astronomy, medicine. He gave them secrets that had once belonged only to the divine, and then he gave them fire, literal fire, stolen from the forges of Olympus and gifted to trembling human hands. With it, they cooked, crafted, protected themselves from cold and beasts alike. Civilization began to stir. Zeus was livid. Fire had not been earned, and Prometheus had not asked permission. To a god who'd clawed his way into power, who'd watched his own father torn down by disobedience. This was not a gift, it was a threat. The punishment was swift and legendary. Prometheus was chained to a rock at the edge of the world, where every day an eagle came to tear out his liver, and every night the organ grew back. Immortal torment, not death, but perpetual violation, a divine warning carved into the cliffs. Scholars often argue whether Prometheus represents progress or hubris, and whether Zeus's punishment was tyrannical or protective. The myth, like all myths, doesn't offer an easy answer. It offers tension. The gods give, but they also guard. They shape, but they also punish. In the age of Zeus, knowledge came at a cost, and yet, Prometheus was only the beginning. Humans, now empowered, began to question. They sculpted idols of Zeus with stormy brows and muscular frames, but they also sang songs that mocked his thunder. They built temples in his name, but also in the names of lesser gods, trickster spirits, even mortals who dared claim the favor of the divine. Zeus could not be everywhere at once. He sent signs, lightning bolts splitting trees near heretical villages, droughts in rebellious regions, dreams filled with warnings. Sometimes they listened, sometimes they didn't, and so began the long, slow campaign, not to win power, but to keep it. Zeus, once the rebel, had become the ruler. He wrote laws about offerings, about sacrifices, about the duties of gods and mortals. He declared oaths sacred, punishable if broken. He created the Furies to chase liars and oath-breakers across the earth. He elevated certain gods to judicial roles. Themis, once neutral, became a seated voice of divine law. Dike, her daughter, was sent to Earth to observe human justice and report what she saw. But even as Olympus grew in order, its king remained restless. He watched the sea and wondered what Poseidon truly thought of their low-drawn realms. He listened to the silence of the underworld and wondered if Hades harbored resentment. He gazed at Heraclever, sharp-tongued, increasingly powerful, and wondered if loyalty was the same as love. He looked at humans, endlessly inventive, and wondered how long their worship would last. Zeus had risen, yes, but above the clouds, where even thunder can't echo forever. He began to understand. Rule was not a throne. It was a constant storm, and storms by nature never rest. The sky had calmed, but Zeus had not. Olympus, now sculpted into a glittering fortress of marble, gold, and cloud, stood tall above the world. Its halls echoed with the voices of immortals born from the primordial dust, others newly risen. The war was over, the monsters subdued, the humans warned. But the throne of Zeus, no matter how high it sat, was not a seat of ease. He had siblings to manage, mortals to monitor, laws to uphold. But above all, Zeus needed to secure something more subtle and infinitely more fragile: order. And that meant shaping Olympus not only as a palace, but as a government. It began with the gathering of gods, not just the 6 who had overthrown Cronus, but others born, invited, or inherited. Some had emerged from battles, others had watched from shadows, waiting to be useful once a king took the sky. Zeus appointed a council, not a democracy certainly, but a divine assembly where each god or goddess would have voice and duty. Hera, his sister and now queen, took the role of sovereign consort. Her domain included marriage, birth, and family, order-fitting, though ironic, given Zeus's Sun-Tobe legendary record of undermining every marital convention she enforced. Poseidon, volatile and proud, remained ruler of the sea. He withdrew to his palace beneath the waves, but kept a seat in Olympus. Hades, quiet as ever, chose not to live among the others. He ruled the underworld alone, governing the dead with shadowed solemnity. He appeared rarely, but always with purpose seemed, never without consequence. Then came others: Hephaestus, god of the forge, limping but brilliant; Aphrodite, radiant and mysterious, said to have emerged from sea foam, or perhaps from Zeus's own, meddling with divine force, depending on which version of her origin you favor. Ares, god of war, already simmering with restless violence; Artemis, cold and wild; Apollo, golden and impossible; Hermes, ever in motion, half messenger, half mischief. The Olympian family tree grew tangled, fast, and tangled trees cast long, twisted shadows to mortals. The gods seemed like a perfect pantheon, eternal, magnificent, terrifying. But within Olympus, they bickered, plotted, seduced, and undermined one another, like any royal court. Perhaps more so, since power didn't just influence politics, Herite was politics. When Aphrodite smiled at Ares, wars broke out in the mortal realm. When Apollo sulked, plagues happened. Even a poorly timed joke from Hermes could send to city-states into civil collapse. And at the center of it all sat Zeus. Triangoph and Phalincto balanced divine ambition with divine discipline. He had learned one thing from his father's fall: never swallow your children. He also learned another lesson, subtler, but just as critical appier, just enough to be feared, but not so often that they tire of your presence. It became his paradox. To remain king, he had to seem inevitable, but not overbearing. He had to enforce order while constantly proving he was not Cronus, reborn. So he began shaping myths. Zeus didn't merely rule. He performed rulership. He appeared in the sky when storms rolled in, always dramatic, always timely. He fathered heroes Heracles, Perseus, Minos, not just out of divine libido, though there was plenty of that, but to place fragments of his legacy in the mortal world. These children of Zeus, demigods with impossible strength or brilliant minds, became walking testaments to his reach. Still, for every child born, a consequence followed. Some mortals worshipped him faithfully. Others began to challenge the gods, claiming divine blood gave them license to rule. Entire cities built cults around Zeus's offspring Guntal. The line between God and man blurred into confusion. And when confusion grows, so does challenge. One such challenger was Salmoneus, a mortal king who dared to mimic Zeus by riding a chariot with bronze hooves and hurling torches as lightning. The theatrics were amusing to his people, but not to Olympus. Zeus struck him down with real lightning, not just for the offense, but for the precedent. Even mocking the gods had its limits. Yet for all his efforts to craft divine order, Zeus remained a creature of contradiction. He demanded fidelity, but often betrayed Hera. He enforced justice, but sometimes manipulated outcomes to suit his favorite mortals. He ruled with authority, but still feared prophecy. One prophecy in particular began to trouble him. It came from Gyre, possibly the myth depending on the telling, but all versions agree on the core. A son of Zeus would one day be born who would overthrow him, just as he had overthrown Cronus. Sound familiar? The cycle threatened to repeat, and so Zeus began to act in secret. When Metas Metas, his first great companion, and perhaps the only being whose intellect truly matched his, became pregnant, Zeus remembered the warnings. He didn't wait for the child to be born. Instead, he tricked Metis into transforming herself into a drop of water, then swallowed her whole. Some say she still whispers inside him, guiding his thoughts, softening his fury. Others say her mind dissolved, leaving only the memory of what might have been. Either way, she never walked the world again, but she did leave something behind in time. Zeus developed a terrible headache, not from stress, but something stranger. He called Hephaestus to strike open his skull, and from it leaped Athena, fully armored, fully formed, and shining with wisdom. Born from Zeus alone, no prophecy-broken bait. Perhaps bent, Athena became his trusted daughter, loyal and fierce. She favored the spear over the hearth, the strategy over the tantrum. Unlike other gods, she rarely caused chaos. Instead, she brought clarity an ally Zeus would need often. But still, the fear of future overthrow lingered. It always would. Zeus had shaped the cosmos, written law, and declared order. But power is like fire. It gives light, yes, but must be constantly fed. Mortals need miracles. Gods need worship, and kings, even divine ones, need something far more elusive, faith, and faith. Once lost, cannot be forced back, so Zeus kept building, kept striking down rebels, uplifting favorites, seducing mortals, enforcing oaths. Every act a performance, every gesture part of a divine balancing act. He had claimed the throne through war, but he would keep it only through myth. And even the king of gods had to wonder, how long can a myth last before someone dares to rewrite it? The throne was secure visibly, at least. Olympus gleamed, the realms of sea and underworld remained quiet, and the mortal world hummed with worship. But peace in the age of gods was rarely more than a thin skin over deeper tensions. Beneath the marble brilliance of Olympus, old rivalries whispered, new allegiances formed in shadows, and myths grew restless before they even finished settling. Zeus, now a fixture of the sky and law, never truly rested. For a being who had once been hidden in a cave and fed by goat's milk, he had become profoundly aware of perception. Power, he understood, was not just held, it was performed, and so he curated every thunderbolt, every divine intervention, every rumor of his glory with the precision of a political campaign. But Olympus wasn't a vacuum. It buzzed with gods who had ambitions of their own. Take Apollo, for instance, golden, dazzling, and born of Zeus's affair with the Titaness, Leto. He was a god of music, prophecy, plague, and the Sunyas, all at once. He radiated with talent and importance, and perhaps most importantly, he knew it. His twin sister, Artemis, goddess of the hunt and protector of wild things, was more austere, independent, terrifying in her silence. They were twins in origin, but mirrors in disposition. Apollo quickly became the mouthpiece of divine foresight. Through his temple at Delphi, mortals and, sometimes even gods came, seeking knowledge of what might be. This bothered Zeus more than he let on. Prophecy, after all, was the one language that didn't always obey him. And then there was Hermes, born to Maia, in a cave. He stole Apollo's cattle before he could walk, crafted the lyre from a tortoise shell, and talked his way out of punishment. He became the god of messengers, thieves, travelers, and clever tricks. Zeus liked him not in a fatherly way, but in the way one appreciates a useful and entertaining employee who always seems to know too much. Hermes became Zeus's eyes and ears across the world. It was he who whispered news from the mortal realms, who watched heroes rise and fall, who returned from places others feared to tread, sometimes with a smirk, sometimes with troubling news, and troubling news came often. Mortals had not forgotten the war between gods and titans. It lingered in their stories, their fears, and their desires. Some honored Zeus with offerings and altars. Others whispered about Cronus in secret groves, muttering about a time before thunder. Some built shrines not to gods, but to ideas, justice, nature, memory. There were even cults for Nyx, the night itself, whose domain preceded even Zeus's. These were not heretics not yet, but they represented a shift. Worship, once a terrified response to storms and famine, was evolving into something more philosophical, abstract, less controllable. Zeus saw this as a threat. He responded with spectacle. Every appearance became a show. Lightning bolts hurled across the sky during festivals. Dreams seeded with his image. Statues erected so tall their feet split hillsides. Entire oracles trained to speak in riddles that always, somehow, circled back to his name. But not even a god could be everywhere. And that's when the rebellions began, it in Olympus. But in the mortal world, one of the earliest came from King Lycaon of Arcadia. Displeased with Zeus's proclamations of law and virtue, Lycaon decided to test the god's omniscience. Depending on which version you hear, he either served Zeus human flesh at a banquet, or simply plotted to murder him in his sleep. Either way, Zeus was not amused. He struck the palace with lightning, turned Lycaon into a wolf, and warned the world. Some lines were not meant to be crossed. This, many believe, is the origin of the werewolf myth, proof that even gods had stories they didn't fully understand, which twisted over time into something different. Scholars still argue whether the Lycaon myth was a warning against hubris, or a commentary on divine surveillance. Either way, the message was clear. Zeus may not control every thought, but he watched, and he punished. But he also forgave when it suited him. Take Sisyphus, for instance, a mortal king who tricked death, escaped the underworld, and managed to outwit Thanatos and even Hades for a time. Zeus, weary of his games, sentenced him to an eternal task, rolling a boulder uphill, only to watch it roll back down. Forever. It was punishment, yes, but it was also art, a metaphor carved into eternity. Power, Zeus understood, wasn't just enforcement. It was shaping meaning, giving failure a narrative so potent that it would live longer than any mortal kingdom, Still, Olympus wasn't immune to challenge, not even from within. Hera, his queen, was not content to be merely ceremonial. She saw his dalliances, his manipulations, his double standards, and though her wrath often fell on Zeus's lovers, their unfortunate children never forgot the root of the problem. Her husband, at one point, she conspired with Poseidon and Athena to overthrow him. They lured Zeus into slumber, bound him with unbreakable chains, and nearly seized power. But Thetis, a sea nymph, summoned Briareist 100-handed. Giant Zeus had once freed from Tartarus. With a flurry of limbs, he shattered the chains. Zeus awoke, enraged, but did not unleash the full storm. Instead, he looked each rebel in the eye and made a quiet, terrible promise. Their rebellion would never be forgotten. This moment, often omitted in polished temple tales, revealed a truth most worshippers would rather not hear. Even gods are afraid of losing control. Zeus became more careful after that. He adjusted. He stopped assuming loyalty and began demanding it more artfully. He offered gifts, roles, praise. He made Athena his war general. He let Apollo claim credit for victories. He granted Dionysus, the mad god of wine and ecstasy, a place on Olympus. Despite his Chaos-Bake's chaos, when contained, could be very useful. Order, Zeus realized, wasn't about eliminating opposition. It was about managing it. Still, the past haunted him. Dreams of Cronus bound in Tartarus, whispering truths through stone. Dreams of Typhon's return, of a child he hadn't fathered yet, who might one day rise up and do to him what he had done to his own father. And so, every thunderstorm was a performance, every punishment, a lesson. Every temple, a reminder, because even as king of the gods, Zeus knew what mortals often forget. Power doesn't end conflict, it merely delays it. Zeus sat on his throne at the summit of Olympus, eyes fixed on the horizon where storm clouds gathered and sunlight blinked like an omen. Below, the mortal world unfolded in messy, glorious Chios feasts, battles, births, betrayals. Every moment, a pulse in the great rhythm he had fought so hard to control. But even now, with a court full of gods and temples singing his name, Zeus felt it. The tide never truly stopped moving. It had been centuria set, least by mortal reckoning since the Titanomachy. The Titans remained locked in Tartarus, but their names still lingered in curses and in the mutterings of old priestesses who remembered the world before Olympus. That world wasn't gone. It was just buried, like embers beneath volcanic ash. And, in one dark corner of the earth, those embers stirred deep in the underworld, far beneath even Hades. Thronashanes groaned. The Hecatonchirus stood guard at the bronze gates of Tartarus, their 100 arms, ever vigilant. But something had begun to change. A whisper, a stirring, a sound that didn't belong. Not words exactly, not language. Something older. Typhon was not dead. Zeus had buried him beneath Mount Etna after their last battle. But monsters born from chaos don't obey boundaries. Typhon's form had scattered, yes, some say. His limbs became desert winds, his voice turned to volcanic eruptions, but his essence endured, and something, or someone, was trying to call him back. Zeus sensed it, before Hermes brought the message. Villages, at the edge of the world places. Even maps refused to acknowledge or port thunder without clouds. Animals fled forests. Springs, dried smoke, curled from mountain peaks that hadn't spoken in centuries. This time, it wasn't Gaia who summoned Typhon. It was Echidna, the monstrous mother of monsters, Typhon's consort and Chaos's midwife. She had slithered from her shadowed cave, birthed new terrors, and whispered to the wind. And the wind answered, Typhon, rose again, not in full form, not yet, but parts of him began to gather. A claw here, a wing there, a voice that curled out of mountain craters and made shepherds scream in their sleep. Zeus did not hesitate. This was not a threat to delegate. He gathered his weapons, thunderbolts forged anew by Hephaestus, each crackling with the fury of 10,000 storm sand, descended from Olympus, not as a ruler, but as a warrior, not to govern, but to destroy. And he wasn't alone. Apollo came with his golden bow, arrows that could pierce illusions and silence lies. Athena, ever precise, brought her shield and her strategies. Even Ares, unpredictable and thirsty for combat, joined the fray, eager to taste war again. Dionysus, even Herodian on a panther-drawn chariot, flinging madness like confetti. It wasn't just a battle, it was theater, and the world watched. Zeus met Typhon near the edge of the western sea, where cliffs broke like shattered teeth, and the wind was thick with sulfur. What emerged was not the full beast from before, but a fractured forja patchwork of old rage and new form. Still, it was enough. The clash shattered the sky. Waves rolled across continents. Birds fell silent. Mountains cracked. Mortals hid in caves, praying without knowing what name to use. And then, Zeus made a decision that would define the rest of his reign. He did not kill Typhon. He could have, perhaps, but instead, he tore what remained of the monster's body and sealed it in different places. A claw beneath Etna, a wing beneath the Sea of Marmara, a scream trapped in the deepest trench of the sea. He scattered Typhon across the world, not to destroy him, but to prevent his unity, to make it hard or impossible, perhaps for him to ever rise whole again. Why? Because Zeus had learned something from the war. Killing chaos doesn't end chaos. It provokes it. It invites a successor. But disorganizing chaos, breaking it into fragments, and burying them far apart, that was strategy. Still, he didn't leave the earth unguarded. He placed guardians, some divine, some monstrous near the sealed remains. He instructed oracles to warn of gathering signs. He tasked mortals with rituals so ancient they no longer remembered what they protected. And he warned the other gods, if Typhon stirs again, it will not be war. It will be collapse. But not all gods agreed with his methods. Hera, as ever, disapproved. Not because she wanted Typhon freed, but because Zeus had acted unilaterally, again, without counsel, without ceremony, without her. She reminded him that kingship required legitimacy, not just force. Athena said nothing, but noted the subtle shift in power dynamics. Poseidon grumbled in his ocean halls, irritated he hadn't been summoned, thought secretly relieved to have avoided the mess. And Hades, when word reached him, offered only a smirk. Typhon's limbs might be scattered, but death, in the end, still reported to him. What truly worried Zeus, though, was what came after. Echidna was not captured. She had vanished, again, slinking into the underlayers of the world, pregnant perhaps, with new monstrosities. Already, whispers spoke of strange beasts appearing. Chimera, in Lycia, the Sphinx, in Thebes, Cerberus, guarding unknown gates. Monsters, yes, but more than that, symbols. Every one of them, a reminder that the world beneath order never dies. Zeus reinforced Olympus. Not physically, marble can only hold so much but socially. He elevated more minor gods, gave them responsibilities. Morpheus, for dreams. Nike, for victory. Nemesis, for retribution. It wasn't delegation. It was insulation. The more layers between him and chaos, the safer he would be. And yet the mortals never saw it that way. To them, Zeus was still the face in the storm, the thunder above the mountaintop, the voice in the burning bush. He was not just a ruler, he was a force. They didn't care if he had scattered Typhon or argued with Hera or doubted himself in his dreams. They built more temples, higher ones, statues with arms raised to heaven, eyes full of awe or fear or both, and, in quiet moments, Zeus would descend to the edge of Olympus, look down at the flickering fires of humanity, and wonder, had he stopped Typhon or had he simply delayed the next version? because every time a mortal struck a match, every time a river surged unexpectedly, or a nightmare clung too long, or a prophecy rang strangely true, Zeus remembered you. Don't kill chaos, you manage it, and pray it doesn't. Remember how to find itself again. The world no longer trembled, as it had in the age of Titans. The earth held its shape, the sky mostly obeyed. The gods had their thrones, mortals had their altars, and Zeus had his lightning. But power, once won, doesn't sit still. It must be tended like a fire, fed, protected, and constantly watched. By this point in the reign of Zeus, Olympus was no longer merely a seat of authority. It had become a living, breathing institution, a place as political as it was divine. New gods were born, or welcomed into its folds. Minor deities petitioned for influence, and the balance of divine hierarchy became a dance with too many feet and not enough rhythm. Zeus had to do more than rule. He had to curate, and while he watched the heavens, the undercurrents of the mortal world began to stir. Down below, the humans had entered what many later would call the heroic Aegea time, when men and women walked. Tala spoke bolder, and dared to see themselves not as servants of the gods, but as their rivals, their lovers, or, worse, their equals. The first name to truly trouble Zeus wasn't a god. It was a man, Perseus, born of Dano, a mortal woman imprisoned by her paranoid father. Perseus was the result of one of Zeus's more inventive seduction techniques. No swan or bull this time, no shower of petals. Instead, he came to Dano as a shower of gold, slipping through the cracks of her prison and into her bed. She bore a son who would go on to slay the Gorgon Medusa, rescue Andromeda, and establish dynasties that shaped the fate of nations. Zeus watched him with pride. Ubu also caution. For each hero born from divine dalliance walked a razor's edge between glory and hubris, and the more celebrated they became, the more Zeus worried they might forget who gave them their spark in the first place. Then came Heracles, son of Zeus and Alcmene. Heracles was no mere hero. He was a juggernaut of strength and pain, blessed with power but cursed with a fate Zeus could neither control nor fully understand. Hera, in particular, hated him not only because he was yet another symbol of Zeus's infidelity, but because the boy seemed destined to rise to high. She sent snakes to his cradle. He strangled them. She cursed him with madness. He completed 12 labors that echoed across eternity. Even Zeus, for all his pride in the boy's feats, grew uneasy. Heracles was mortalmously, but myths have a way of folding time. A strong enough mortal could become immortal in memory, and that was a threat no god could ignore. Some historians of myth suggest that Zeus used Heracles' trials, not just as punishment or redemption, but as a test to see whether a helm could shoulder the weight of godhood without breaking the order of Olympus. When Heracles' deed burned on a pyre of his own makings, intervened. He plucked the hero's soul from the flames, cast aside his mortal shell, and welcomed him to Olympus as a god. It was an unprecedented gesture. Mortals had been beloved, worshipped, even feared, but never granted divinity. Some gods, particularly Hera, were furious. Others marveled at Zeus's boldness. But none of them missed the message. Loyalty can be rewarded with eternity. Still, Zeus could not elevate every favorite, and for each hero he lifted, there were others who defied him, like Prometheus. Still bound to his rock, the eagle circling daily dot, and then there were those who bent Zeus's will without breaking it. Consider Orpheus, the musician whose lyre could make trees weep and stones dance. When his wife Eurydice died, he descended into the underworld, a feat few attempted. Fewer survived in charmed Hades and Persephone with song. He was permitted to take her back, on one cruel condition, that he not look back. He failed, but the fact that he was allowed to try, that the boundary between life and death cracked for music alone, spoke volumes about the soft spots in divine armor. Zeus watched all this, quietly, carefully. he began issuing more laws. Oaths became sacred contracts, binding not just mortals, but gods themselves. Swear by the river Styx, and the oath was unbreakable even for Olympus. This came to matter greatly when Helios, the sun god, made a promise that nearly destroyed everything. His mortal son Phaethon begged to drive the chariot of the sun across the sky for one day. Helios, bound by oath, agreed. The boy lost control almost instantly. The sun veered to high scorching the heavens, then to low scorching the earth. Crops died, rivers boiled, creatures wailed. Zeus had no choice to stop the devastation. He struck Phaethon down with a thunderbolt. Helios never truly forgave him, but the lesson was burned into memory. Not even promises made by gods are immune from the consequences of chaos. And sometimes, mercy is denied for the sake of balance. Zeus didn't always act alone. He rarely consulted, but he often calculated. He used other gods the way a general uses regiments. Apollo to soothe with prophecy, Athena to advise in war, Hermes to carry uncomfortable truths, and sometimes Dionysus to scatter confusion when clarity grew too dangerous. But through it all, his true adversary was not monster or mortal. It was memory. Cronus's shadow still lingered, not in the form of rebellion, but in the weight of precedent. Zeus had overthrown a tyrant. If he became one, how long before someone attempted the same? He never said it aloud, but the thought never left him. Will one of mine rise like I did? Will one of my sons or daughters swallow the stars while I sleep? So he watched. Every divine birth, every mortal uprising, every whisper in Delphi. He smiled at celebrations and frowned at prophecies. He maintained the storm not because he loved it bad, because it was the only thing that reminded the world he still held the bolt. Olympus remained glorious, shining, terrifying, alive. But if you looked closely, if you listened beneath the thunder, you could hear the truth. Zeus had won the throne, but keeping it that was the real labor of a lifetime. By now, Zeus was more than a god, was a system, a mythology unto himself. His name invoked awe in temples, his face was carved into mountainsides, and his stories had traveled from fireside chants to formal epic. But all empires, even celestial ones, contain their own weather systems of doubt, and Zeus, for all his thunder and showmanship, remained constantly aware of the storm within his own legacy. He had defeated Cronus, ended the reign of the Titans, survived Typhon, and established divine law. Yet one conflict still echoed louder than lightning in his mind, the final confrontation between himself and his father. Because while that battle had long passed in the physical sense, its spiritual and symbolic aftershocks continued to ripple. After Cronus fell, his body was not destroyed. It was restrained, bound deep in Tartarus and Wrexel by mortals, unreachable by time. But minds like Cronus didn't rot. They waited, and sometimes, in dreams, or during volcanic rumblings, Zeus thought he could still hear that ancient voice, murmuring about cycles. Just as I rose, the voice seemed to hiss. So will another. That fear had shaped every decision Zeus made since the war. It wasn't just about maintaining or to rot, it was about breaking the cycle. But cycles, as any weaver or prophet will tell you, don't break easily. They fray, they bend, they reroute. So Zeus took steps. He ordered all references to Cronus's rule softened in temple retellings. Myths were rewritten. The story became less about a father's overthrow and more about a natural succession. Cronus became a cruel figure. Yes, but not one worth pitying, not one worth remembering. He was a villain, not a victim, a problem, not a precedent. Still, memory resisted erasure. In rural pockets, old stories endured. Some mortals whispered that Cronus had once ruled in a golden Agethoth. His time had been gentler, if naive. Others told tales of how Zeus's rise had caused more conflict than it resolved. These voices were not loud, but they hummed like a storm gathering far beyond the horizon. to stamp them out. Zeus took to shaping a narrative of his own, divine order. He commissioned Hermes to travel the world and deliver new commandments, new stories. He sent Apollo to prophesy carefully selected messages guiding mortals toward a version of truth that flattered Olympus. Even Athena, rational and rarely sentimental, lent her voice to the project. Embedding divine logic into mortal philosophy, Olympus wasn't just a mountain anymore, it was an idea, a bureaucracy of eternity. But then came something Zeus didn't predict, the rise of new gods, not foreign, not monstrous, but emergent. These weren't children of the Titans or chaos-born creatures. They were personifications of increasingly complex human concepts. Nike, the spirit of victory, began to gather followers who saw her as more than a figure of war. Morpheus, the dream shaper, crept into mortal sleep and brought messages independent of Olympus approval. Thanatos, once a silent figure of death, became whispered about in philosophical circles as a guide rather than a threat. These figures didn't challenge Zeus open libet, they represented a shift. Worship was becoming fragmented. Mortals no longer bowed only to thunder and flame. They knelt before thought, sleep, memory, and abstract principles. And among these new ideas came one more ancient than any, fate. The Moirath fate shed existed since before Zeus, before Cronus, before even Uranus. Clothos spun the thread of life. Lachesis measured it, Atropos cut it. They answered to no one, not even the king of the gods. This infuriated Zeus. He tried to ignore them at first. Let the mortals fear those three veiled figures in distant myths. Let them spin and snip. But fate had become popular. Mortals began to believe that even gods could not escape destiny. That Zeus himself was just a thread like the rest. That his rule was not eternal, only scheduled. So he summoned them. Whether he met them on Olympus or in a shadowed cave, no one knows. But it's said that when Zeus confronted the Moirai, he demanded their loyalty or at least their silence. They declined, with a smile, perhaps, or perhaps no expression at all. They simply returned to their spinning, measuring, and snipping. Zeus left furious, not because he could defeat them, but because he couldn't. In a kingdom he built with flame and will. These three old women represented a truth he couldn't rewrite, that everything gets included as an end back on Olympus. Zeus began preparing for possibilities. He looked harder at his children, not with love or pride, but with calculation. Could Apollo, rebel could Athena, outgrow obedience? Would Heracles' cult rise too high? And what of the new goddesses, those, like Persephone, now queen of the underworld, half Olympian and half shadow? What of Hecate, who moved through crossroads and thresholds, untouched by lightning? Zeus began making alliances, quiet ones, strategic marriages, unexpected favors. He granted Demeter a season of mourning each year, winter so long as Persephone returned in spring. He allowed Dionysus full godhood, despite the chaos he invited, because it distracted from deeper shifts. He made Artemis a protector of youth and sworn to virginity night, out of morality. But to keep her from forming attachments that could turn political, Olympus became a chessboard, and Zeus played every side. But his nightmares returned. He dreamed of a child knit, one he knew, but one yet to come with eyes like fire and no fear of thunder. A child who wouldn't kill him, necessarily, just replace him. Sometimes, in these dreams, Cronus laughed, and sometimes, Zeus laughed with him. Because deep down, the king of the gods understood, he had not broken the cycle. He had merely disguised it. His reign was not a new order. It was a temporary calm before the next name took shape. He still held the thunderbolt, but every time he raised it, he felt the weight not just of power, but of time, and time, as he well knew, always remembers. The thunderbolt, once a symbol of conquest, had become a scepter majestic, yes, but also ceremonial. Zeus still hurled it from time to time, often in grand gestures during mortal festivals or as warnings to those who forgot their place. But he knew the weapon that had overthrown titans now served more as a reminder than a threat. Most mortals had never seen lightning as divine wrath. Most gods had not tasted war in an age. The world had settled, and so Zeus turned to administration. After all, ruling was no longer about defeating monsters, it was about dividing realms, assigning duties, managing rivalries. The cosmos, once a wild theater of conflict, was now a celestial bureaucracy, and the gods, like officials in a sprawling kingdom, needed boundaries. So the great division began not just of territory, but of function. Zeus, as sky and king, retained dominion over law, weather, and cosmic balance. Poseidon ruled the sea, every crashing tide and gentle ripple bending to his moods. Hades governed the underworld, though he ruled from afar, never quite sitting comfortably on Olympus's polished steps. But beyond the brothers, the realms grew, more granular. Apollo was named steward of music, prophecy, and the sun's golden path. Artemis governed the wilderness and the moon. Demeter held sway over agriculture, the fertile cycle of growth and decay. Aphrodite presided over love and beauty, though many whispered she wielded more power than even Ares, in times of peace. Ares, god of war, was given reign over bloodshed and fury. Thou, Zeus always watched him closely, wary of the chaos he stirred. Hera, still queen, took charge of marriage and childbirth, filled with contradiction, as most marriages on Olympus were, anything but harmonious. Athena became the guardian of wisdom and tactical warfare. Embodying the intellect Zeus both admired and feared. Each god had a place, a path, a purpose. And yet, despite these boundaries, Olympus was rarely quiet. The gods quarreled, sometimes over realms, sometimes over mortals, often over pride. When two gods claimed the same territory, say, the city of Athens, led to contests. Athena and Poseidon both wanted that gleaming city. Poseidon struck the earth and created a salt spring. Athena offered an olive tree, symbol of peace and prosperity. The people chose her. Poseidon sulked for decades. Other times, the disputes were over mortals themselves. Zeus had declared divine law. No god should favor one mortal too extremely. But of course, this was more suggestion than enforcement. The gods meddled. They took sides in wars. They gifted weapons, sent dreams, seduced queens. And always, it was Zeus who had to clean up the mess or pretend he hadn't seen it. The Trojan War stands as a shining example of this chaos. A conflict rooted not just in mortal ambition, but divine meddling. It began not with an insult, but with a wedding. Thetis, a sea nymph and future mother of Achilles, was to be married to the mortal Peleus. All the gods were invited except Eris, goddess of strife. She arrived anyway, throwing a golden apple into the feast, inscribed with 3 words. To the fairest. Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite all claimed it. Zeus, no fool, refused to judge. He sent the task to Paris, a mortal prince of Troy, and the rest unraveled predictably. Aphrodite promised Paris the most beautiful mortal woman, Helen of Sparta. Helen was already married. The war that followed lasted 10 years, saw heroes die by the dozen, cities burn, gods take sides, and Zeus once again sitting above it all, watching with a mix of bemusement and dread, because every divine intervention was a gamble. Every time a god bent fate, the wheels spun faster, and Zeus understood better than any. Too many spins, and the whole thing unravels. He began to wonder if delegation was truly working, so he tried something new, ritual. He instructed mortals to establish rites and ceremonious net, just as acts of worship, but as structure. By making worship predictable, he made beliefs stable. By tying divine favor to specific actions, offerings, sacrifices. Festivalshi created a system. One that mortals could follow, one that gods could be held accountable to. He also expanded the network of demigods. Children born of gods and mortals weren't just walking tales, they were connective tissue. Each one tied Olympus to earth in 1,000 subtle ways. Their successes became divine PR. Their failures served as cautionary tales. But the system had flaws. Not all demigods were obedient. Some, like Theseus, Bellerophon, and later, Jason, pushed too far, demanded too much, or acted in ways that made Olympus look fallible. Bellerophon, for instance, tried to ride Pegasus straight into Olympus, hoping to claim a seat among the gods. Zeus sent a gadfly. Pegasus bucked. Bellerophon fell. Mortals remembered the lesson. Ambition is admirable until it flies too close to thunder. Even more dangerous were mortals who denied the gods altogether. Pentheus mocked Dionysus. The Bacchae tore him limb from limb. Niobe boasted she was greater than Leto. Apollo and Artemis answered her pride with arrows. Actaeon stumbled upon Artemis bathing. He was turned into a stag and torn apart by his own hounds. Zeus didn't always order these punishments bait. He didn't stop them either. They served a purpose. Fear, after all, is an excellent adhesive, and Olympus needed to hold still. Zeus wasn't blind to the growing complexity of things. He noticed how humans were becoming more self-reliant, how philosophers began to describe the gods not as beings, but as metaphors, how tales once told in temples were being performed in theaters, with laughter as common as awe. He noticed how gods like Hermes became symbols of communication and speed in an increasingly connected world, how even Hades, once feared, became a figure of balance rather than doom. The pantheon had not changed, but its meaning had, and Zeus, forever seated at the peak, had a choice: adapt or be remembered like Cronus, powerful, yes, but irrelevant. So he adapted. He commissioned new festivals, Olympic Games, to celebrate divine favor through mortal strength. He allowed temples to be run, not just by priests, but by scholars, letting mortals interpret as well as worship. He let Apollo build Delphi into not just a sacred site, but a think tank of myth and philosophy. Zeus stopped being just the god of the sky. He became the god of order through complexity, of authority through myth. And in doing so, he traded some of his raw power for longevity, because lightning, as he had learned, fades, but stories, those last forever. Olympus, by now, was more than a mountain. It was an institution, layered with rituals, stories, hierarchies, politics, and silent negotiations. Mortals looked up to it with reverence. Scholars analyzed it with awe, and even the gods themselves sometimes forgot where divinity ended and performance began. Zeus had shaped this place with thunder and law, but what he couldn't sculpt, not entirely, was peace. Because even if the titans were bound, the monsters buried, and the mortals obedient for, now there was one enemy that never tired, never stopped whispering, never obeyed the rules: memory. And memory had a way of creeping in when Olympus least expected it. It began with murmurs. Small cults rose up, not in defiance, but in nostalgia. People told stories not just of Zeus, the king, but of Uranus and Gaia, of Cronus and the age before lightning. Some said the world had been simpler, then more fertile, less punished. The Titan Age, though brutal, was remembered by some as an era of closeness between nature and divinity. And these whispers grew not into rebellion, but into retellings. The most dangerous thing a king can face is not revolution, but reinterpretation. And Zeus, ruler of order, watched as his own image began to splinter, not because it weakened, but because it became too many things at once. To some, he was a sky god who defended justice. To others, a cunning seducer who punished rivals and played favorites. To philosophers, he became a metaphor for natural law. To dramatists. He was a character to be questioned, mocked, or even pitied. In one play, written for an Athenian festival, Zeus was depicted not as a mighty ruler, but as a weary old god, chasing after mortal women, and failing to control his bickering divine children. The audience laughed. Zeus did not. Still, he allowed the play to go on, because punishing laughter only gives it power. Instead, he focused on what he could shape Olympus itself. He began a new campaign, one of war, or law, but of infrastructure. Temples across the world were rebuilt, refined, or expanded. Priests were trained not just in prayer, but in storytelling. Festivals became grander, more theatrical. In Olympia, games were held every 4 years, competitions of strength, grace, and endurance, meant to honor the gods, but especially him. These weren't just events. They were reminders. Zeus didn't need to hurl lightning to be feared. He could exist in ritual, in architecture, in habit, but even rituals could be manipulated. As other gods gained popularity, Apollo with his radiant clarity, Athena with her composed intellect, even Dionysus with his joyful chaos, Zeus noticed something unsettling. His name remained, but his relevance sometimes blurred. It was no longer enough to be king. He had to prove it again and again, so he turned to symbols. He had the eagle, the oak, the lightning bolt, but he also encouraged more nuanced icons: storm clouds over temples, statues with open arms, coins stamped with his face, looking ever skyward. One curious image that emerged in certain temples was Zeus as a judge, seated, bearded, eyes closed, not casting thunder, but listening. This softer vision wasn't necessarily less powerful. It was enduring, timeless. But not all of Olympus was as reflective. Gods like Ares, Artemis, and Hera still moved in patterns of intensity and pride. Even Athena, as wise as she was, could be stubborn when mortals misused knowledge. And then there was Dionysus, whose influence spread like vines through the cracks of formality. His cults were unlike any others. They danced, they screamed, they dissolved social roles, they drank until meaning unraveled. And they did it all in the name of a god Zeus had once tried to deny. Dionysus was, after all, the son of Semele, a mortal. Zeus had tried to protect her, even lied to Hera about the affair. But Semele had asked to see Zeus in his true form, and divine radiance, as it turns out, is fatal to mortal eyes. She perished in flame. Zeus, grieving and stubborn, snatched the unborn Dionysus from her womb and sewed him into his own thigh. A second birth, from the king of gods himself. It was strange, messy, unprecedented, but perhaps that's why Dionysus survived. He was dual-born, both mortal and divine, destruction and joy, structure and madness. A contradiction too obvious to ignore, and too useful to destroy. Zeus eventually gave him a throne on Olympus, not out of affection but out of recognition. Dionysus represented something Zeus couldn't ignore: release, where Zeus ruled with structure. Dionysus reminded the world that structure was temporary, that joy, even wild and terrifying, was necessary, and the people loved him for it. This rattled Zeus in ways thunder never could, because while Dionysus tore down barriers, Zeus had spent centuries building them. And it begged a question: could a king coexist with chaos? Perhaps, so long as he defined the terms. Zeus allowed Dionysus his cults, but only in limited regions. He permitted ecstasy, but within structured festivals. He let mortals dance and shout and laugh it under watchful eyes. It was not suppression. It was strategy. Still, whispers rose from shadowy places that Dionysus was the true heir, that his death and rebirth made him more powerful than the sky god, that perhaps the future didn't belong to lightning, but to wine. Zeus, unsurprisingly, hated that, but he didn't strike anyone down. He simply reminded the world through earthquakes, through stormy omens, through sacred silence, that no one dances forever. Meanwhile, A new presence grew on Olympus. Persephone. Daughter of Demeter, queen of the underworld, wife to Hades. And perhaps Zeus's most subtle political move. You see, it was Zeus who had given Persephone's hand to Hades, without telling Demeter, the abduction. If it was an abductionist, one of the most contested myths in all Olympus. Some say Persephone was stolen, others say she chose her path. Regardless, she ate the seeds of the underworld and was bound to it now. For half the year, she lived among the dead. For the other half, she returned to the light, and that rhythm and return became the seasons. Zeus had turned heartbreak into cosmic structure, a pattern mortals could depend on. But Persephone, over time, became more than a symbol. She ruled beside Hades with confidence. She guided souls. She saw things no one else did. And some say she began to understand fate in ways even the Moirai did not. Zeus noticed, he watched, because even as he sat on the throne of Olympus, with every realm divided and every festival honoring his name, he knew he had built a system. But systems do not stay still. They evolve, they grow, and sometimes when they've outgrown their maker, they remember how to break. It started with murmurs, as these things often do. Nothing Zeus could strike with a bolt. No temple to raise, no clear villain to curse, just ripples, oddities, a sudden quake where there was no fault line, a string of inexplicable dreams shared across distant cities. Priests waking with blood on their tongues, and no memory of the prayers they uttered. Mortals speaking prophecies they didn't remember learning. Zeus had felt these disturbances before, and they always meant the same thing. Something old was stirring, but it wasn't Typhon this time, nor a forgotten titan clawing his way from Tartarus. No, this was more insidious, quieter, less a rebellion and more a reopening, a return of unfinished stories, unhealed wounds. And right at the center of this slow unraveling stood the same unpredictable trio that had haunted him since the Titanomachy monsters, mortals, and mutiny. Let's begin with the monsters. They'd never gone away. Not really. Cerberus still guarded the gates of Hades. The Hydra slumbered deep in swamps no mortal dared tread. The Nemean lion's descendants prowled remote cliffs, but these beasts had been contained, catalogued, tamed by heroes, or hidden in corners of myth. Until now, Echidna, the mother of monsters, began moving again. Some said she never died. Others claimed she'd merely waited hibernating in deep caverns, her body coiled in centuries of stillness. Now, she was stirring, not with rage, but with intent, and her children old and new were emerging. A chimera burned down a city-state in Asia Minor, its breath melting stone. A sphinx settled outside Thebes, devouring those who failed her riddles. In Thrace, a wild boar the size of a mountain flattened entire villages before disappearing into the forest like smoke. This wasn't random. These were messages. Echidna, long silent, had decided it was time for the gods to remember that order was not absolute. That chaos had not agreed to Zeus's treaties, and Zeus, sensing this reawakening, responded as he always had, with fire and force. He summoned heroes, mortal instruments of divine will. To each, he gave a task, a trial, a monster to slay, a riddle to solve, a symbol to erase. And to the monsters, he sent his quietest threat. I still remember how to end things. But while monsters tore through, backroads and heroes marched off with glinting swords and divine armor. Something more dangerous simmered beneath, the mortals themselves. They had changed. No longer trembling peasants begging for rain. These were thinkers, builders, warriors, who asked questions. Philosophers who looked up at Olympus and saw not gods, but flawed immortals who bickered and betrayed. Just like them, Prometheus's gift fire of knowledge had taken root. Zeus saw it in every scroll of mathematics, every temple built with precise astronomical alignments, every debate in agora about fate, logic, virtue. Mortals were using reason to explain the cosmos. Not thunder. It made his temples feel like stage sets, and that unease only grew when mortal kings began to name themselves divine. Some claimed Zeus's blood. Others declared their cities chosen by Athena, their lineages blessed by Apollo. A few, drunk on power and flattery, even suggested the gods themselves were irrelevant, that mankind could thrive without them. Zeus found these moments irritating, not enraging, just insulting. He responded selectively. A lightning bolt here, a flood there, plagues when the mood struck, but not out of cruelty, out of correction. He didn't want to destroy them, just remind them. Still, for every city he punished, another rose in quiet defiance, building sanctuaries not to Olympus, but to concepts, justice, peace, nature, abstracts the gods didn't own, but once did. It was not rebellion, but it was erosion, and erosion, given time, does what no earthquake can. It undoes foundations. Then came the worst of it, mutiny, not from the titans, not from mortals, but from within Olympus. It began with whispers, rumors that Apollo had grown restless, that he questioned his father's decisions more openly, that he prophesied futures where new gods would rise and old ones would fade. One version of the tale claims he asked Zeus point blank if Olympus was eternal. Zeus said nothing. The silence was enough. Athena, too, had become more reserved, more independent. Her temples outnumbered Zeus's in some cities. Her wisdom became law in councils that rarely invoked the king's name. She didn't challenge Zeus outright, but her influence became a quiet rebellion. Even Hermes, once Zeus's loyal messenger, began spending more time in the mortal world than Olympus. Mortals needed his guidance, his speed, his neutrality. He delivered prayers without judgment, secrets without alignment, and Dionysus. He had stopped pretending to care about Olympus entirely. His cults grew. They danced in woods, drank under moonlight, whispered truths about gods that temples dared not utter. They called Dionysus the god of the new world, one who brought freedom, not order, ecstasy, not fear. Zeus considered acting. But how do you strike down a god who dances? How do you punish mortals who are laughing? And how do you stop a movement when no one admits it's a movement? The final insult came not from Olympus or Earth, but the underworld. Persephone, queen of shadows, began holding court, independent of Hades. She spoke with ghosts. She wrote new rules. She guided souls with compassion, where Zeus would have offered judgment. In some regions, people prayed to her instead of him, not for thunder, but for fairness. Zeus watched all this from his throne, high above the clouds, and felt a sensation he had rarely known. Irrelevance. He still had power, still commanded storms, still held authority, but he could feel the shape of belief shifting, not collapsing, just drifting away. And so, he adapted. Again, he sent dreams instead of bolts. He whispered into the minds of poets, urging them to write epics with his name woven into every stanza. He blessed temples with fertile harvests, hoping gratitude would translate into worship. He smiled at mortals when he used to scowl, and yet, even with all this, he knew the monsters were not just echidna's children. The mortals were not just fireborn experimenters, and mutiny wasn't always an army. It could be a forgetting, a slow, silent storm where belief becomes memory, and memory becomes myth, and myth becomes dust. By the time the first philosophers began carving questions into stone, questions not about what the gods had done, but whether they existed at all, Zeus had already felt the shift. It was not a war, not a rebellion, not even a storm. It was something quieter and, in its own way, far more threatening. Doubt. Mortals were growing bolder. They didn't stop building temples or holding festivals. Of course, rituals still ruled the calendar. Offerings still burned. Priests still mumbled prayers at dawn. But beneath the surface of incense and hymns, something else had taken root, thought without fear. Where once Zeus's name meant unquestioned authority, it now appeared in symposiums alongside other ideas tossed around in conversation like wine in a cup. Is the thunder god truly omnipotent? Does he govern justice, or merely claim it? If mortals possess logos riasando, they not stand equal to the divine. In Athens, scholars debated whether lightning was the fury of Zeus, or just a natural phenomenon, to be measured, charted, understood. For centuries Zeus had governed through spectacle and law. Now, spectacle looked like theater. Law came from city councils. And worst of all, mortals had stopped being afraid, so Zeus watched. He didn't rag on it immediately. Rage, he had learned, was memorable, but unsustainable. And besides, how does a god smite an idea? How do you hurl thunder at philosophy instead? He leaned into the contradictions that had always defined him. He became the contradiction, the Allfather and the absent king, the lawgiver and the rule-breaker, the bringer of rain and the seducer of queens. He showed up in dreams not as fear, but as metaphor. To poets, he whispered about balance. To generals, about the weight of power. To kings, he sent riddles. And to rebels, he sent silence which often spoke louder than thunder ever could. Still, the gods below Olympus weren't helping. Dionysus was a riot of ecstasy and subversion. His cults had expanded far beyond vineyards and wild dances. They became places where women could be more than wives, where the poor could speak beside the rich, where the divine wasn't distant, was intimate, messy, human. Worse still, the feminine was rising. Hera, always powerful, had reasserted herself not just as a queen, but as a goddess in her own right, distinct from Zeus's shadow. Her temples gained followers who honored her not as a wife wronged, but as a protector of women, a guardian of sacred oaths. Athena's wisdom was now sought more often than Zeus's thunder. Soldiers carved her symbol into shields. Lawmakers cited her justice. Philosophers invoked her name when arguing logic, strategy, and clarity. In many cities, her temples outshone his, in marble and mindshare alike. Even Hecate, goddess of thresholds and shadows, began to rise. She didn't compete for templish, didn't need to. Her power grew in spaces between certainty, the crossroads, the moonlit paths, the unspoken doubts between belief and knowledge. And then, quietly, without any fanfare, Hera stopped speaking to him. They shared Olympus, yes, shared ceremonies, thrones, and rituals, but she no longer advised. She no longer challenged, she simply existed beside him, cold and composed, not as a partner, but as a parallel. And Zeus realized something chilling. He had lost the loyalty of the one being who had most often held him accountable, not to betrayal, but to apathy. That, more than any prophecy, disturbed him. Meanwhile, his children grew. Apollo's cults spread like sunlight, touching corners of the world even thunder never reached. Hermes became a symbol of commerce and language. Cities invoked him to bless trade routes, not because he was powerful, but because he was reliable. Ares stayed chaotic, but had found renewed purpose in the growing conflicts between mortal empires. War never truly sleeps. Even Persephone, once quiet in her seasonal rhythm, was now being hailed by mystics as a bridge between life and death, not a hostage, but a queen in her own right. Zeus had sired them, shaped them, but now they were shaping the world without him, not in defiance, but in independence. He had taught them order. Now they were applying it differently, and mortals began to reshape the very idea of the divine in some places. They merged God Zeus with Egyptian Amen, creating a hybrid deity with traits borrowed from both. In others, they placed him among countless others, not as king, but as one of many, and in even bolder places. They suggested the gods were mere reflections of human ideals, archetypes, stories to understand the world, not beings who shaped it. This wasn't sacrilege, it was evolution, and Zeus, for the first time, realized he might be turning into exactly what Cronus had become to him, a memory of power. So he made a decision, not to strike, not to rage, but to retreat strategically. He stopped appearing in mortal affairs as often. Let his children take the forefront. Let temples focus on abstract divinity rather than specific demands. Let thunder become a symbol, not a sentence. And, quietly, he began preserving himself in myth. He sent dreams to a poethesiodlinting stories that would endure, not truths, but carefully crafted tales, a genealogy of gods, a cosmic order, a narrative that cast Zeus as the rightful ruler, the bringer of law, the protector of mortals, not perfect, not kind, but necessary. The story would live longer than belief, because when thunder fades, myth remains, and Zeus understood. Stories, not bolts, were now the real power. He was no longer king in the way he had once been, but he could still be king in memory, in legacy. In the crackle of storm clouds that still made farmers pause, in the thunder that followed, silence in the statues that still faced skyward. He was not fading. He was transforming, and even gods must learn to evolve, or be forgotten. Time passed not, the time measured by mortal calendars, or temple bells, but a deeper time, the kind that weathers mountains, dulls marble, and erodes names etched in stone. Olympus, once the glittering crown of divinity, now stood quieter, not abandoned, just settled. No more lightning splitting the sky in righteous fury. No more divine decrees hurled from clouds, just the wind, the whisper of leaves, and the distant hum of memory. Zeus remained, but not in the way he had once filled the world. His presence had become something subtler, woven into myth, stitched into tradition, tucked away in rituals past, down more from habit than conviction. In the great libraries of Alexandria and beyond, scholars still recorded his deeds, but they did so with a certain tone, half reverent, half academic. They spoke of him as they would of ancient kings, with admiration tinged by skepticism. Zeus the Thunderer, the Cloud Gatherer, the All-Father, and yet some scrolls asked questions their authors dared not voice aloud centuries earlier. Had Zeus truly brought order, or merely replaced one tyranny with another? Was his rule just, or merely effective? Had the gods shaped mankind, or had mankind shaped the gods? These weren't rebellious questions. They were the gentle curiosity of a world learning to walk without divine handholding. Mortals had built cities whose towers rivaled Olympus in ambition, if not height. They crafted laws, elected leaders, founded schools where the stars were mapped and nature obeyed principles. Zeus never dictated. They did not stop honoring the gods, but they no longer needed them. Zeus noticed this most in the prayers. They became softer, rarer, no longer urgent cries for rain or mercy, more like farewells. He still had his followers, of course. Remote mountain villages, where offerings still burned. Old temples where the priests, now more caretakers than mediators, lit the fires at dusk. Some emperors even adopted his image, adding his face to their coins, cloaking themselves in borrowed thunder. But these were shadows, echoes of a time when his voice alone could change the course of a war, or rewrite the laws of nature. He had once feared becoming Cronus, dethroned tyrant, bound and broken. But that fate had not come for him. No. Zeus's decline was not dramatic. It was peaceful, which, in many ways, was worse. There was no war, no heroes uprising, no divine rebellion, just forgetting. The most silent kind of dethron. He now understood the full cruelty of Prometheus's gift. Fire had been the least of it. The true power given to mortals was memory shaped by curiosity, and curiosity never stays in one place. One day, Zeus looked across the pantheon. Some gods had vanished into obscurity. Others had adapted, reinvented, or merged with foreign names. Dionysus lived on in the wine and the theater. Hermes lingered in every messenger, every merchant. Athena guided every courtroom. Even Hades was remembered not worship as the quiet necessity at the end of life. But Zeus, he lingered, not as a storm, but as a story. His temples cracked with age, their columns wrapped in ivy. Tourists, not worshippers, walked the marble floors, snapping pictures, reading plaques. They spoke of mythology. They whispered reverence for ancient culture, but they did not kneel. They did not pray. Zeus watched, and finally, he understood what Cronus must have felt. Not hatred, not lost, but absence. The knowledge that the world has moved on without needing your voice to guide it. Still, there was beauty in it, because to be a god is not just to rule, it is to endure. And Zeus, king or not, had endured in sculpture, in song, in story, in every rumble of thunder that made a child ask, what was that? In every lightning strike that lit up the night sky like a warning from something beyond human, in every old man muttering about the old ways, about the sky watching. Zeus had become what no war or prophecy could ever achieve. He had become myth, and in that, he had found something better than power. He had found permanence, not on Olympus, but in us. So here we are. The storm has passed. The thunder has softened to a murmur behind distant hills, and the sky stretches wide and calm, no longer a battlefield but a quiet witness. Zeus, for all his might and mastery, did not fade in fire or fury bowed in silence, not erased, just remembered differently. And maybe that's the way of all legends. The things that shake the world eventually settle into it, like stones in a riverbed, worn smooth by the currents of time. They don't vanish. They become part of the landscape of the stories we tell to explain ourselves, to trace our hopes and our warnings. Zeus's story isn't just about gods and monsters, lightning bolts and golden thrones. It's about change, about how even those who wield the most power must one day step back and let the world breathe on its own. So, if you ever hear the wind rustle the trees just before a summer storm, or see lightning crackle across the night sky, take a moment, not in fear, but in wonder. You're not alone. You're just sharing space with a very old story, still humming faintly beneath the clouds. Now close your eyes. Let the weight of centuries melt into the dark. The gods are quiet. The stars are steady, and the world ever turning slowly.